apologies for the technical difficulties due to which we're starting late, but it is my great pleasure to announce our speaker for tonight, Professor Miri Rubin of the Queen Mary University of London School of History. I first met Professor Rubin at a conference in Oxford, which was very interesting and which had some connection to what she'll be talking about tonight, and that is Strangers in Medieval Cities, a Diverse and Challenging Reality. Professor Rubin is an author of a very interesting book called Cities of Strangers that deals with this issue that I'm recommending to you to read if you can. And without further ado, Professor Rubin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nina. And I have to say, well, good evening to everyone, but also that Nina has been, I'm very grateful to you, Nina, that we've been trying to plan this event in the face of all sorts of dramatic events happening in my family and my schedule and so on. And you've always been very, very, very understanding. We hoped that I would be able to be in person in Belgrade, and I still hope that I will be coming at some point and we will interact face to face. But for the moment, I'm now going to share my screen now. So again, thank you very much for gathering on Friday afternoon. As you see, I'm on a very, very unusually English sunny early evening, and it's just a pleasure to end the week with this much anticipated event. So in my conversation with Nina, obviously I was developing some of the ideas that emerged from the little book. That if you do look at the book, you will understand that it was the product of a series of lectures that I delivered at Queen's University Belfast. It's a very well established and distinguished series called the Wiles Lectures. So it was quite an interesting occasion to reflect in 4 discrete lectures that then have to add up to a book and get published about a topic that was totally new to me. Nina, for some reason, I'm getting the screen from the other thing. I'm just going to cancel it, okay? Yeah. Are we okay now?
Yes, I think we are.
Okay, just the screen from the other link came up. So just to explain the context, it was I was invited to give those lectures in the summer when I was on holiday, and it was that summer, if you remember, and of course in your region you remember well, of the big movement of refugees from Syria into Europe. And, you know, I was sitting on my holiday in Italy and I was thinking about it. And I said, actually, if somebody asked me, how would a person arrive in a new location, in a new city, and integrate in the Middle Ages, and I'm somebody who knows about cities and about the Middle Ages, I actually did not know what the process was. And I thought, therefore, this would surely make a really good topic to get into, to research, and then to deliver those lectures, and ultimately producing the book. So that sort of explains a bit, you know, where it came from. So I'm just going to start by reminding you, of course, that when we talk about cities in medieval Europe, it is very, very much a world of urban life that still depends and benefits from what had been the great achievement of the Roman Republic and then Empire in terms of creating this extraordinary network of urban centers, all linked up, which left for medieval people an extraordinary infrastructure of roads, of aqueducts, of hippodromes, of basilicas, of, well, everything that makes urban life possible and communication within the empire easy. So obviously the greatest density of urban life was around the Mediterranean, but even as far north as you see in Yorkshire in the UK and northern Germany and parts of the Low Countries and so on. And of course in your own region you're very much aware of the Roman past. So I'm not suggesting that you can read this map, but just the sheer density of Roman implantation, which of course in the 5th century with the diminution and ultimate destruction of the western part of the or decline of the western part of the Roman Empire, when the services that the empire could give to its citizens diminished greatly, and of course, then became that whole space was broken up into kingdoms of the Franks and the Vandals and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and so on. And nonetheless, this fabric was there. And not just the material fabric, but also the institutions of Roman civic life, in as much as, say, in parts of Italy, definitely up to the Muslim conquest of large parts of the Mediterranean, in Iberia up to then, in what is southern France of today, and further on into the Adriatic and so on. There was still quite impressive vestiges of those civic institutions of Roman life, in terms of officialdom, in terms of local taxation, in terms of schools to teach law. And of course, in the north, it was less densely present, and therefore the remainders of it into the medieval centuries, let's say the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, was less intense. And that is why, when around the year 1000, there is population growth and commercial, a sort of really dynamic upsurge in Western Europe, it is those parts of Mediterranean Europe that really have the best infrastructure and the best resources and the best traditions to really take off in a very, very big way. And of course, other parts of Europe are also both developing their urban centers, say a place like Paris, which isn't very important, becomes the great capital. But also what's really dramatic is thousands of new towns and cities are created in the period after 1000. So I think it helps to remember that it doesn't come out of nothing. And what's particularly important is, and I know some of you will be people interested in the law, is particularly the resource that is Roman law, when that re-emergence of urban life in the 11th, 12th century and so on occurs, it is very much with the resources of Roman law at the disposal of those in charge in order to develop institutions and indeed legislation, and around the issue that we're interested in this evening. So, Nina, could you remind me, did we start at about 6:20 or so, just so that I time myself appropriately?
Well, maybe 6,
or rather
18
7
or something.
Sorry?
Yes. Well, maybe it was 15, 16, 18.
Okay, not a problem. I should say 7, of course, but I'll do that for myself. Okay, so that
the minutes are the same.
So I'll stick to the timing that we spoke about yesterday. Okay, so just for a moment, what do we think about? What's distinctive about urbanness, and those who claim that really urban life is something like a continuum rather than a sort of quantum leap. That is to say, you can have villages that have certain types of big villages, and they have a sort of urbanness about them. You can have cities in which aspects of rurality also exist. That is absolutely true. Nonetheless, the phenomenon of the city and city life, urbanness or urbanity, is associated with population density, and hence proximity, closeness of those residing in the city, but also the need for a variety of interlocking skills for the processes of manufacture, of commerce, and of civic management that, of course, coalesce and develop in the urban center. And of course, those who thought very deeply about urbanness, and we can go back to Aristotle for this, always emphasize that urbanness is not just some sort of phenomenon, a bit of land with walls around it, or with certain types of institutions. It is the laws. It is the laws, not the place, that make the city. And as we'll see, when medieval folk in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries are thinking about their now either revived or indeed newly created communes, urban centers, they think about them and they reflect on their strategies, on their desires for their cities, on the shape of their cities. They think through the heritage of law and other forms of knowledge, other lore from antiquity. And just to give you a few examples of very influential writers, so we see, for example, that great encyclopedic writer Isidore of Seville, who was from Iberia in the 7th century, very much a synthesizer, collector, and compendium maker of the knowledge of antiquity, he describes a city, civitas, is a multitude of people united by a bond of fellowship. It is named from the citizens, cives, that is, the inhabitants of the place, because it decides upon and holds the lives of many people. Urbs is the town itself. The civitas is not rocks, but the inhabitants. That is, there's something much more than just the material fact of a lot of people living together in one place to make an urban community a civitas. With the emphasis on this civic nature. And that is exactly what we might call the culture, the ethos, and the procedures. And of course, all of that is regulated by law. You will hear the echo of these ancient ideas also reverberating through the far more elegant Brunetto Latini, who is a very important Florentine intellectual of the 13th century, who both was sort of chancellor of Florence, and then he suffered ignominious exile. So he's a person who really understood the rough and tumble of urban life. And again, in his great again, a sort of encyclopedic work, but this time in the vernacular French, he wrote, from that time they began to build houses. He's writing about the emergence, the beginning of city life. From that time they began to build houses and strengthen cities and fortresses and enclose them with walls and ditches. From that time on they began to establish customs and laws and rights, which were common to all the city dwellers. For that reason, Cicero says that the city is an assembly of people for living in one place and under one law. And in another version of this, he says living rationally in one place, under ratio, right? And under one law. So you see here the really great importance of the law to the conception of what a city might be. And why is the law so important? Because city life is all about collaboration and regulation of the shared close environment and its resources. So urban projects really depended on urban life on creating trust, all sorts of trust in the officials, trust in that people will not abuse the resources of clean air or of fresh water, trust that if you enter into an agreement, say of lending money or borrowing money, that this is a sound transaction, trust in those who give testimony in court, trust in those who create the written record of urban life, the all-important notaries, and in those who keep an eye on the street and keep people behaving correctly and apprehending those who don't. Hence, who can be trusted is a really, really important question, because if cities depend on the influx of new people you don't know who their family were, you know nothing about them, then how do you decide whom you can trust? And this is something that clearly those who run the cities, the urban elite, the officials, all men, they had to define the right to reside in a city in a way that would protect those who are already there from those who they need to come and join them, but on what terms? And of course, that demand is in every walk of life, of people of the most extraordinarily diverse talents. You need just workers, just even people with very little skill that may be skilled up or may never be skilled up in the city, just offering working hands. You need militias to be manned. You need a whole array of craft skills. You need and of course you need people who will be earning enough to contribute to the tax base of the city. And all of these people have to be brought together and bound by trustworthiness. And if somebody is going to join, then on what terms can you know they can be trusted? And just to show you one project that it always takes my breath away, to show just what I mean by cooperation, collaboration, and trust, is this project of the water supplies of Siena, because Siena, as you know, is on the top of a hill, and the water supplies. There are some sort of springs that can be used, but again, it's as the city grew, the demand for water was greater. And we have evidence, in a way, looking at these subterranean tunnels that you see here that lead water, and they're still in wonderful condition, even if they're not quite used in the same way. And they basically reached every garden of every house, of every tenement in Siena by the 13th century. In fact, the evidence which you see, the evidence of your eyes of all these types of supplies of water, exists even before the administrative documents of Siena have survived. So just think of the degree of collaboration, of supervision, of resource allocation that is related in digging in subterranean system of water supply in a city, and even ultimately this glorious, still existing and still absolutely stunning pool, the Fontebranda in Siena, where a whole set of rules regulated in what order its waters can be used. And the last ones to use were the dyers of the city and the textile workers, who, of course, after they used the water, is very polluted and is not fit for drinking. And how did they develop this ability to work together? Well, I'm going to be moving slightly forward in time, but nonetheless, it's utterly irresistible, because in the early 14th century, as you see there, the Council of Nine, who ruled Siena, it's probably from about 1260 till the Black Death, there was this sort of republican rule by a council made of leading craftspeople and bankers and merchants. And they are the Nove, the Nine, and this is a Sala dei Nove, the hall in which they met and had a long table, and they did their deliberations. And they surrounded themselves with these quite extraordinary frescoes. I'll show you in a minute. Some of you know them perhaps, and perhaps have seen them in the flesh. I can tell you that you can never see them in this way, because the room is always full of tourists. This is a quite privileged view with nobody there. In order to, in a way, both reflect what they were doing and perhaps also to remind them of the responsibility on their shoulders, the Nove commissioned the most important painter in Siena at the time, Ambrogio Lorenzetti, to paint their chamber. You see this, the wall on the right is the buon governo, what happens when the city is run well. I'll show you a detail in a minute. And the one that's right in front of us is the arrangements of the law that allow for the city to flourish in this manner. And then there is the wall that you can't see, which is on the left, and it's also much destroyed, not such in good condition, is that of the mal governo, that is to say, what happens when the city is really badly run. So let's just go to the city as is well done. I think it really, really captures, first of all, this proximity aspect, this aspect of the city as a densely situated, much built, and in Italian cities, very built up high, as you see all those towers of the various families, in proximity. Everybody can see the business of everybody through the windows. It's surrounded by a wall, as you see. The wall has gates and people come in. And if you see on the right there, you see pack animals carrying food. You see livestock being shooed through the city. And the city also is one where people go out. They go out of it for trade, but also in this case here on the bottom left, you see these very elegant ladies perhaps going out for the hunt or to take the air or whatever, but it's a place where people feel safe. You see this group of ladies dancing in the middle to represent allegorically, as it were, the absence of worry, but also particularly for women. Women are safe in the street, right? And then you can also see in these various studios that are on the ground floor, perhaps you cannot see, but if you do, you'll see that there's a teacher sitting there with some pupils. You have a weaver at his loom. You see people playing games of chance just a bit. And perhaps at the top, you can just divine there are some roofers there finishing off the roof of a city. So this is a hub of activity, of cooperation, of training, craft, and leisure as well, all happening within the city. And it's all thanks to this amazing system of law, represented here again by the virtues that govern the city. All those ladies sitting there on the right of the picture, and above them you perhaps cannot see it, but they represent the virtues that make the city good. Fortitudo, Justitia, magnanimitas, it just rolls off the tongue, these Latin words that represents all the qualities that citizens have to bring ultimately in order to produce pax. Pax is that second row with the lady in the white who's sort of leaning back in a very relaxed manner, because it's peaceful. The city is peaceful, and it's thanks on the left, as you see, to the operation of justice that weighs carefully and justly the matters that are brought in front of the magistrates. And at the bottom right, you can see those who are taken to, those who are brought to court, those who are taken to prison as well. So the system works, and then it produces the sort of, well, it produces this sort of well-being. And when it doesn't work, it is really very scary. You get that sort of tyrannical, well, tyrannos, you do get tyrannical rule over there. That's the person there on the right. You may not be able to see it, but the countryside is full of wolves and dogs. It doesn't produce food. Nothing is regulated. It's really very bad indeed. And ultimately, to capture what these cities are aiming at through care of their common good is this lady here, again, a personification, an allegory really of Securitas. If you can see top right, top left, there's Securitas. And she says there, Securitas is about, it's about the sowing of the seeds in time. So you see these fantastic sort of vineyards and food producing fields that she hovers over, but also the rule, the just rule, and that will produce together the securitas, both provision of food, but also provision of justice, as we have seen. So given this vision of the common good that is developed in these societies, as we've seen already in words, Brunetto Latini, in images, Ambrogio Lorenzetti, historians have really tried to, particularly in the last, say, 10 years or so, to reflect on, and it's amazing that this hasn't been done before, but it has not, to reflect on how then do these cities, with a great sense of their well-being, how do they deal with diversity? How do they maintain but also transcend the category of stranger? And I've just put there a number of works from scholars from different traditions to show that this work is really progressing, and it's extremely interesting. And of course, it goes without saying, just like mine was, that it is also informed by the dilemmas that we face as we confront issues of the movement of people, of refugees, etc. And of course, your region knows it very well. I need not dwell on that. So going back to the theme of trust, the first dilemma is cities are full of strangers. They need strangers to come. They need them to stay for a while or forever. And how do you extend trust to them? So far, on the whole, I have tended to speak as if all urban centers were self-regulating and therefore self-legislating. That is, of course, not the case. It's just the most interesting cases, I think, that are, because they've left us a lot of statutes. But of course, urban centers could evolve in a whole variety of political environments. So, for example, they can be founded by kings. The English kings loved founding cities. So did the kings of France, or princely, or princes, or dukes. That is, lords who say, this is going to happen in my lordship. I shall relax my own lordship over a certain part of a certain area, certain land, or I shall give particular privileges to existing cities. in order to encourage urban life, because urban life will be very useful to my own domain. And this becomes absolutely clear. There is no contradiction between royal aspirations and a well-regulated system of enfranchised urban centers. If anything, they only benefit from it. And of course, in places like capital cities, say Paris, it's evident that the royal interest and the urban interests are sort of very closely interwoven. They're not the same, but they're absolutely interdependent. Also, cities developed around cathedrals, cathedral cities, or also the other way, that is to say, a lot of the earliest cathedrals, those that evolved in Roman, in imperial Roman civitates, were already urban centers, and that is why the cathedrals were developed in them. But cathedrals also were developed throughout the later centuries in areas of new conquest, like, say, the areas of North Germany or parts of Eastern Europe. So a cathedral will be planted there, and of course urban life will then coalesce around it. Towns develop around monasteries or pilgrimage centers, just because there's so much coming and going, and there's need for provision of food and accommodation and so on. So already quite a lot of the functions. So that monastery will perhaps recognize that center and give it certain rights, or indeed, if it's within a domain of urban legislation under kings or lords, they will be the grantors of the privileges. And towns are developed at convenient crossings, at bridges, in sea and river ports as well, bit by bit. Some urban centers benefited from that sort of wonderful fabric I already talked about: the roads, the walls, the aqueducts, the basilicas, the public meeting places, the ditches, which they then maintained, extended. And it's a well-known phenomenon in the Middle Ages that a city that already had walls, perhaps basically Roman walls that were then added to, in the period of growth, very quickly, by the late 12th or early 13th century, they had to move outside the walls and then have another sort of belt of wall around them. But everyone, in whatever the pathway to urban autonomy was, all of them depended on the assemblage of newcomers, of workers of little or no expertise, of experts in craft, in law, in medicine, and finance, and traders, and they needed teachers too. So just a little step sidewise, just to remind you of the sort of terms that, if you were reading sources in this area, you would come across a lot of terms that are used interchangeably, and one just has to live with that. So we have the forewords, that which comes from the Latin foris, outside, forinsecus, forensis, forestiere in Italian, forain in French. Fremde, of course, comes from that. We have extraneus, another Latin word, which gives us strangers. We have hospitus, which is the word favored by the Hungarian kings, hence I mention it here. We have alienus, alienigenus, that is born elsewhere, which gives us the word alien. And there's an associated word, not the same, which is incola or habitator or morador in Spanish, somebody who's staying, who's around, who's sort of settled, but not necessarily with citizenship rights. So a multitude of terms, but where did all these different strangers come from? So the most common form of migration to a city is, of course, from the immediate hinterland, from the contado, from the surrounding countryside, rural into urban, usually male and female workers who end up then working in households or workshops. And of course, workshops were based on household structure, so they may offer, servants in workshops or domestic servants, but they may also train in the course of this belonging to a workshop. And there's another pathway, which is people will come to live in the city ultimately because they already had a pre-existing economic relationship. So they were maybe regular suppliers from the countryside, regular traders who came to the markets for a limited, very, very carefully scrutinized period of time, and then left, but ultimately said, actually, I just want to move into the city. And then there's a process that allows that to happen. And then there are the more structured type of relationships that are actually initiated by the city for its own well-being. City governors or rulers or councils who go out and recruit, say, a podesta and his retinue, a podesta being a sort of combination of judge and military leader who were often invited for limited periods of time into Italian cities in order to govern them, because very often there was so much competition between existing great families of the city that they were always fighting. And this develops in the 13th century of bringing podesta, comes from the word of Latin, the Latin potestas, podesta, who comes runs the city for them basically for a number of years, and they come with a retinue, and they come with their families, so it's a big group of foreigners, as it were, coming in for a while. They invite bankers for obvious reasons. Credit is required. They'll invite protected groups under royal patronage, say bankers, or say groups of miners that are required, or people with certain types of skills that are really rare. And this movement of these specialist people, as it were, that the city needs, they can come from the region, or they can come from very far away. For example, Venice always invited for the scrutiny of metal German experts who come and would cross the Alps and come and settle in Venice. And these groups, then, they can be groups if it's from the Contado, they just blend in after a few generations. You don't know where they came from. But when it's ethnic groups, these ethnic groups may wish to retain their specificity, retain their language, retain their religion if it's a different religion. So that's a greater challenge, and that's quite interesting. And we will see a little bit later how that's regulated. So just to show you the sort of trace in the chronicles of how this process is described is this lovely entry from Toulouse, again, part of that southern France, part of that what used to be the old Roman world, with a very strong urban infrastructure that just takes off enormously in the 12th and 13th century. So a Chronicle of Toulouse describes for 1226 many men and women with lords and others without lords, that is to say servile or not servile, some with their goods and others without them, greatly improved the city of Toulouse and its suburbs, and the community which grew and daily received them. They contribute and they become part of it. And just to show you how these people come, but also a lovely picture here, a very, very rare case where the customs or the rules of a city are actually illustrated, because usually these are very wordy documents. So this, in the case of this southern French town of Agen, a bishop's town, you see here a lovely representation of people literally coming from the countryside towards the gates of the city, as you see there, and bringing food. So the first relationship of familiarity can be one of coming from the countryside, basically to sell produce, to sell sort of surplus produce, which is massive, obviously, need to feed the city. So people from the immediate countryside are feeding the city. And then, of course, this relationship can take the next step as well. So local statutes in communities that had this measure of autonomy, like a lot of the Italian cities, like some of the French ones, like some of the German ones, have their autonomy allowed them, their privileges allowed them to have the jus statuendi, that is to say, the right to make their own statutes. So these then are a wonderful, wonderful source for seeing, when these guys get together and deliberate how to regulate the entrance and the arrival and the stay of foreigners, what do they think matters? And I really enjoyed, I went over tens and tens, probably more than 100 sets of statutes, because every commune in Italy has sort of published its statutes, and a lot of others elsewhere as well. And it's really interesting. You can almost hear the conversations and deliberations that led to a particular set of clauses in every set of urban statutes. You have a few clauses about the issue of foreigners, incomers, etc. So they then deal with the requirements for settlement and also with the pathways to full citizenship, which of course doesn't happen straight away. There's a process there. And of course, it's all cast within the Roman law jurisprudence that guided these statutes. And even we find that a lot of the sort of German statutes and the French statutes that have a lot of sort of, couleur locale, and they have a lot of local customs and traditions. They're still all based on Roman law precepts of citizenship, and also very often the scholars who actually contributed to the deliberations, contributed the legal expertise to deliberation, they themselves, many of them, went to be educated in Bologna. And that's also true of some of the English experts, despite the fact that England had its own common law, which has a totally different system. So in those places where it is not the local community that legislates, like in England and France and the Iberian kingdoms, where royal charters decide how towns live and also, therefore, what happens with their foreigners, then, of course, it's not up to the local community to legislate. So those types of charters are very interesting if you're studying kings and their interests. They're not as sensitive to issues of local deliberations over the issues. Nonetheless, they're important sources. So, for example, royal charters regulated, say, the King of France invited a bunch of moneylenders from Asti in Lombardy in the 12th century to come and settle in Paris to provide credit. The kings of Hungary in the 13th century invited the Jews when they wanted to rebuild Buda after the Mongol invasions. The kings of England in the early 14th century gave a series of privileges to allow Flemings to settle in England and develop businesses, particularly textile, okay? So we have these different pathways to creating the legal environment that control the lives, the entry, the lives, and ultimately the possibility of enfranchisement of newcomers. And cities also influenced each other because the cities looked at each other and what works here, what works there. And of course, there's a whole legal community that sort of conveys, and also a community of bureaucrats who convey this knowledge. So a city like the very famous 1277 statutes of Ragusa Dubrovnik borrowed from the laws of Venice, although at the time they were actually part of the Kingdom of Hungary. But Venice was like a sort of economic partner and model, and the laws look very, very similar. Or large parts of Central Europe and the Baltic, where a lot of urban life was enabled by the immigration eastwards of German merchants. The model that they all followed was a set of laws known as the Magdeburg laws. So it's not just local community bubbling up with its own ideas. There develops very quickly a sort of expertise in urban law, and that includes also the issue of how best to govern. What is the best practice to govern the issue of newcomers and to create that trust? And although this whole community is doing its business in Latin, by the early 14th century, we have a lot of examples of the statutes being translated by the councils into the vernacular language, like the case of Siena, and you see it here, very pretty. The statutes in 1309 are translated, and the reasons they give is that, and I'm quoting here, so that poor people and other persons who do not know Latin grammar and others who wish to will be able to see and make a copy of them. I think that's a slightly, that's a bit of rhetorical flourish there. Nobody expects poor people to be occupying themselves with the laws in a very big way. But what it does mean is that amongst the judges, amongst the guild members who serve as officials, there could be those by the early 14th century who do not have Latin or do their business, in fact, in the local dialect, and therefore it's sort of useful to have, and there is some evidence actually that Mario Ascheri, the great historian of Roman law, but also historian of Siena, has shown that copies were made actually for officials in the vernacular. And wherever a city legislated, it really took trouble to spread the word in various techniques. Some cities had the laws actually carved on walls. We have here a case like from this community near Porlezza, near Lake Lugano. So here, for example, the statutes themselves determine that the statutes written above have been read by me, Parisio Betto, notary of Porlezza, at the order of the command of the Lord Giacomazzo Ferraro of Vigevano, podestà of the said community of Porlezza, in the commune square. So you have to read them out, and it's useful that they're in the vernacular so people will understand, and they're regularly read out, and when there are innovations, they're read out too. So the rules are in place, and what do they envisage as a pathway to citizenship and to belonging? So the first stage of settlement is if people want to stay for more than just coming to the market, going home the next day, or something of the kind. Some places allow to stay for 3 days. If you wanted to stay for more, the first thing you have to do is get somebody to act as surety, as guarantor. It's like the contemporary practice of having a sponsor if you want to move to another country. So if any foreigner comes to live in the said land and its district within 15 days, he should give and must give guarantors of £50 or more. Otherwise, he cannot live and stay in that land and its territory. So the issue is you have to find someone who has enough wealth that if you do something wrong, if you abscond, if you steal, if you don't stand by your word, there's somebody who will compensate the citizen or citizens who have been offended by your bad behavior, if you've turned out to be not so upstanding as the citizens are meant to be. That, of course, is an ideal. So you always ask, so how does a person who's just coming, how do they find someone to sponsor them if they know nobody? So that is why I introduced earlier that beautiful image of people coming, doing business in the city, and thus developing some networks of acquaintances. Of course, there's also the phenomenon of chains of migration. They may have a relative who already migrated, and then they can come and they have somebody to stand surety for them. Once they've somebody has stood surety for them and they sort of are around and being and are considering staying for longer, this again, it's simply, I cannot but show you these absolutely glorious illuminations from that set of coutumes, the customs of Jean. You see, this is the scene where a citizen, somebody who wants to join as a citizen, it's the chap on the far right, is putting his hand on the Bible. And these are the members of the council who are deliberating about his statement of his desire to join. And we'll look at the text now. So he has to, first of all, free himself from his Lord within a year, and with his hand on the Holy Gospels also forswear heretics and vaudois and all manner and all errors of heresy. So it's quite interesting. It's not just the issue of the skill that he brings, or whether he can be trusted with money or business. It is also this religious probity. And remember, Agen is in the south of France, which is an area that throughout the late 12th and 13th century was famously touched by what was called the Cathar heresy. This was much persecuted and prosecuted, and therefore it's an anxiety. It's on people's minds. It creates trouble. It creates violence. So this person has to put his hand on the Gospels to say, I forswear I'm nothing to do with heretics, and vaudois is a particular branch of heresy, and all manner of other errors of heresy. So there's that element as well. So each region has its own preoccupations. And next, there is this process of probation, which lasts a year, and this gradual entry also into civic duties, which I find very interesting. So he will appear then, this is the man, right, who was kneeling with his hand on the Gospels. He will appear before the Lord and his council at their judgment to answer all complaints against him, and that within a year and a month he will buy in Agen a house or land or a vineyard, that is, real estate, something substantial, and for that year and a month he must be excused from military service and the watch. So the duty on the citizens is to contribute to the safety of the city, and there is a rota by which they do military service and they stand watch on the walls. Well, it's fair enough that if you're not a full citizen and you do not have the full benefit of being a citizen in that year, in that probationary year, you do not have to do that service. It is also perhaps because you cannot be trusted. Just to show that citizenship is a process in Perugia too, in 13th century Perugia, again over 10 years. So it's much less speedy than in Agen. Anyone from our vicinity or district who stays in the city or burg of Perugia with his family for 10 years continuously and does not owe servile homage, again, it has to be a free person, and against whom there are no complaints during these 10 years, will be free and unrestricted with all his goods. So this is a really good example of, well, first of all, this issue of citizenship as a path, as a process, but also just, the fact that there is this statute does not mean that there wasn't a tremendous amount of sort of people going to court, people petitioning, and so on. Because what does it mean? There are no complaints during these 10 years. What is a complaint? Somebody's cross with you because of some, I don't know, you open your window and you threw water out and it spilled on them, or somebody complains that you're untrustworthy in business. I mean, again, this is open to interpretation by the council, but these are the principles that are laid down. So what I'm trying now to introduce is, although I'm going to work with you here, I'm working with you here on the legal sources because I thought that would interest you. Of course, any law produces the need to have courts that deliberate and actually apply and enforce the law, but it's not absolutely crystal clear. In some places, the council actually uses pre-existing institutions of civil society, like the guilds, in this case, the crystal workers of Venice. So they sort of outsource, in a way, the process of scrutinizing people's economic or commercial or craft viability, and also collecting the fee for citizenship. So in the statutes of the Guild of Crystal Workers, the Cristallai of 13th century Venice, and if any foreigner comes and wants to work in this craft, he will be obliged to swear to the art, to swear to that guild, and pay 5 soldi, of which a third goes to the Chamber of Justice and 2/3 to the craft guild. So the craft guild is scrutinizing. Is this guy, can he actually blow crystal? Okay, he can. Okay, he will join, and he will pay a fee to join, and a third of it goes to the coffers of the city. So it's a sort of collaboration over the issue of scrutiny. So clearly the city of Venice here reckoned that if the guild members are willing to take on this new member as one of their own, to trust him, to trust the quality of his work, to trust the quality of his collegiality, then that's fine for us in terms of him beginning his process of enfranchisement of a citizen. And as we saw already in the case in Agen, if you're going to be a citizen, you have to show you care about the place and you have a stake in its well-being. And you do so by buying a property or building a home. And it's really interesting to see how pervasive this is. I mean, in some cases in the Marche, in central East Italy, they actually gave plots of land and even building materials. They said, oh, you can cut wood from here and you can collect stones from the river to build your first home, the starter home. If it were so simple nowadays for people to start. I don't know how it is in Belgrade, but in the cities of England right now, no person under 40 can hope to ever own their home. So in Fribourg in 1289, he must buy himself a house in our city and must make it his personal home there with his family and his wife. And if he does not, that house he bought will remain with the city and he will no longer be a burgess. So as to say, if a person starts the process, buys a property, but doesn't actually settle with a family, or with a wife at least, to start a family or to hope for a family, then that house will be confiscated by the city. And this is quite interesting because often there is a sort of problem. This was definitely the case with the Lombards, with the men from Asti in Paris. You get these communities of men, of youngish men without families, and they can be troublemakers. They can be violent, they can be abusive to women, etc. So what they want is a nice, settled family man who can be trusted. And they try to encourage us through this sanction of they're going to confiscate the house you bought if you don't start a family. So in Siena, because we're dealing quite a lot because the materials are very interesting and just a little bit more about it. So citizens were, the law actually recognized as sort of, although there are pathways to citizenship in the 13th century, there is also a distinction as to whether you were born a citizen or become a citizen. So there is distinction between what they call the ancient, true, and natural citizens, and those who are continual citizens, people who've joined and now they live with us. And there is a distinction because the ancient ones are the ones who can hold the high office, the highest office. Only they can hold it in the first generation. That is, if you're a first generation citizen, you cannot. But again, with the influx of a lot of people and the challenges of meeting the challenges of these criteria caused, and competition between cities for citizens, in the 1309-10 version of the statutes, they relaxed these criteria, and both in terms of how much money you have to bring into the city and also the length of residence. And again, Siena developed this quite a process around the evaluation of the house, because as we saw in Fribourg, you have to buy a house, and that's the basis of everything. And if not, it'll be confiscated if you don't actually move into it and live in it with your family. But what is a house? You can just have a hut. That's not so risky for you. But if so there's also a sort of, there are criteria as to what counts as a house. And this is a very nice document of a guy called Gerrino di Sertano of Casole, just north of Siena, who was an immigrant into the city from the Contado, from Casole, and his application was scrutinized over a year, 1311 and 1312. So throughout that year, the process was, there was a vote. He's okay. Gerrino is okay. He can become a citizen. Gerrino was committed. He had to build a house. Then there's a petition that he bought the land. He informs the council he bought the land, and indeed he built a house in San Pietro in this particular neighborhood. And this would serve now as surety for him becoming a citizen. But before this could be agreed upon, the city's builder assessor had to actually check the house and confirm that it indeed met the quality of being a house of at least £100, 100 livres, worth at least that quality. So it's not just any old hut that you can just build overnight. It has to be of a certain quality, and you have this whole administration. So you have a particular builder who does the assessment because he's the expert. It's super interesting, I think. Now, earlier on, I mentioned that there are these communities of difference that are brought into the city at the behest of because of the city's needs. It can be the Podestà, it can be Tuscan bankers in Venice, it can be, and these are communities that are really very different, speak a different idiom. At least if you come from the countryside, you have a certain familiarity, you speak the local idiom. It's not so if you've come from afar, if you're a Tuscan banker in Venice, or if you are a Jew in Paris or an Armenian in Lviv. It's not just also the language and the distance that you've traveled, it's also your religion in some cases, it's your ethnicity. And so how do we think about these groups? These groups who can be settled in a city for a long time. And in that sense, they're like totally local, they're not going anywhere. And yet they have certain aspects of difference about them. And clearly these communities were totally able to tolerate that. They were able to tolerate that until they were not. That is to say, until certain pressures, certain crises create the sort of disruption of government, disruption of order, that then means they become really, really vulnerable, super vulnerable. So, and I'll give some examples. So, very often in such communities of bankers and merchants, it is indeed groups of men who are journeying, they stay, they go, they come back, and they sometimes have a separate neighborhood for themselves. Like, for example, the merchants of the Hanse coalition in Northern Europe, they had a whole neighborhood called, well, not exactly a neighborhood, a sort of compound, let's call it, the Steel Yard in London, or the Rue des Lombards for the Italians in Paris, and so on. And they developed their own institutions. So these are groups who are regulars in the city, and they're going to continue coming, and their sons will, and their nephews do, but they still want to keep their connections with the home or original community. They want to speak their own language. They want to have chapels in which they worship the saints of their original community, say Tuscan saints in a chapel in Venice. And it's quite interesting because our terms aren't very good at describing them. They're not strangers. They're not really strangers. they're local, definitely comes to communities of Jews who've been there for generations. In what sense are they foreigners? But on the other hand, they have about them a certain aspect of difference that can make them vulnerable and different and set them apart. And sometimes they even benefit from privileges, long-standing privileges that kings have given them or that the city has given them at their point of arrival for reasons that seemed very, very beneficial for the city at the time. And just to show what this vulnerability means is that when we get this world, this totally dramatically traumatized and disruptive world after the Black Death, just to remind you that the population of Europe in large parts was decimated as between a third and a half of its population. And quite frankly, what we've been through with COVID, however tragic it was, is just nothing to compare. It is hard to even imagine what went on over the very short period of time between late 1347 and 1349, some in Scandinavia 1350. And there's a lot of disruption of governance, there is depopulation, there is tension in cities around the smaller economic pie, as it were, of this diminished world. And we find that there are tens of massacres of Jews in German cities. There are, because of a lot of sort of disruption and warfare that happens in the later 14th century. We have a lot of examples of violence in cities, like, for example, the war between the Pope and Florence in 1376 to 1378, that saw the Tuscan merchants literally killed, robbed, and kicked out of the city. And they were long settled in Avignon, where they were the purveyors of credit to the papal court. We find violence against Flemings, long settled Flemings in London, in their own neighborhood, when the so-called peasants' revolt, which were basically people who were not Londoners, who came from other counties, and they come into the city and they see these foreigners who to Londoners are just our neighbors. We know them. But to those who came from outside, they sounded different, they looked different, and 56 were literally, their heads were chopped off. And more of that in London as well. So my last thought will just be that if we've seen the rule of law and we saw the traditions of Roman law organizing the laws around the entrance of strangers into cities in this period of growth and flourishing and expansion on the whole, which is the late 11th to the mid 14th century in Europe, that whole set of arrangements really collapses in a world of vast depopulation, the crash of many aspects of economies, the collapse of the tax base of cities because of the depopulation that they experience, and yet constant competition over working people. So what we find is that into the public square, new voices enter. And these are the voices of religious enthusiasts, religious preachers and teachers who seem to gain a space in public discourse, particularly in these Italian cities where they are very, very numerous, and often set the tone on issues like business, on issues like dress, what you can wear in the outdoor, on issues of marital morality. So it's as if the collapse of the underpinnings of the arrangements that had ruled so well in the 11th, 12th, 13th century through periods of growth and a lot of change and expansion, other voices come into the civic conversation, which it is impossible to imagine any of them being passed in the 12th or 13th century. So, for example, we find that the Jews who were settled in Siena from at least the 12th century and live very near to the Palazzo Pubblico, to the Campo, the great famous square. So they legislate in 1384. So some wise men, lovers of the faith of Christ and of the honor of the glorious and most blessed Virgin Mary, have provided that no Jew be able to stay or reside in any house or palace which abuts on the Campo of the city of Siena, nor in any house or palace which abuts on the road or street which goes from the Punta San Marco to the Croce al Travaglio. That is, if any of you visited Siena, this is the Via di Città, where every tourist goes through with all the lovely shops and whatnot. So in these central cities, Jews should not have these prime properties anymore. Even if their shops are there, their homes are there, they have to move further from the center, not so much to be seen. That's 1384. In the early 15th century, tens and tens of Italian cities are affected by the preaching of a very charismatic preacher, a sort of super preacher called Bernardino da Siena, and many cities decide to take his moral precepts into their codes of law. That is not Roman law legislation, is it? It is moral legislation around issues of not just about Jews, but about everything that's bad that's happened to your city has happened because you have not been good Christians. So you have to be better Christians now. And it's to do with sexuality, it's to do with homosexuality, it's to do, well, I mean, the sort of moral panics that we know actually, alas, in several parts of Europe even, and the United States even today. This is him, and this is, as you see, the preaching and in front of the Palazzo Pubblico. So this is not in a church or outside a church. This is in the civic domain, the preaching. And you see the women and the men are separated there by a divide. So just to give you the flavor, the Jews who had been invited in order to settle and provide credit services in the city now. What does Bernardino think about credit? And he thinks it's particularly bad in the case of Jews, but he actually thinks this about anyone who lends at interest, a Christian as well. Spiritual wealth, he says, and it's rather convoluted because it's medieval Latin, but bear with me. That is faith and obedience to the ecclesiastical precepts. With other spiritual treasures of true Christians, they, the Jews, do not cease to rape, disparage, consume, devour, and dissipate with poisoned cajolements. Now, don't worry if you don't know exactly all these words, but they're all really bad words. So Jews do all of these bad things, rape and steal, etc., to the spiritual wealth of Christians. And they do it with their poisoned cajolements, poisoned persuasions, by their refined friendships, by toxic gifts, by pretended conversations, by deceitful thoughts and acquired freedoms and favors. They have privileges, dragging with them to hell the unhappy souls of irrational Christians. So 300 years of urban life, where you created a balance between the need of this for this type of diversity, this is just an example of the Jews, there were other groups, is thrown out because it's not good. Because all these people dealing with money, and particularly the Jews, are actually dragging Christians who are collaborating with them, unhappy souls, to hell. And ultimately this leads, in the lifetime of Bernardino, to legislation in Siena. Each and every Jew, both men and women, of whatever age they be, those who are, will be, and will come in the future, a big and ample O of the roundness indicated below, and of crocus color, that is really bright yellow, cloth. They should wear a yellow tag. And this, you can imagine how surprised and shocked I was when I opened these statutes. And this circle was drawn, and it's 11 centimeters across, as he says, of the roundness indicated below. That is to say, it has to be a really quite a big yellow sign on their garments, not something that, you know, like a tiny little logo that nobody would notice. This is a big, so we're starting to mark the Jews away, move them from the center of town. And in a lot of Italian cities, there were actually expulsions of the Jews. But the funny thing is that in a lot of cities, you expel the Jews, and within weeks or months, you're giving privileges to Jewish families to return to do the exact jobs that they did before. On less favorable, in more obviously following trauma of displacement, to do the exact same services because the cities needed them. So to just summarize, to say there were all these urban contradictions in the attitude to strangers, and we actually don't even have a word to describe them. In fact, I love the example from some German cities where they employed the term conquivas. That is to say, they're not kivas, they're not citizens, they're conquivas. They're sort of like fellow citizens, but not kivas, that is the Roman term exactly, because a lot of cities didn't allow Jews to become citizens, but they're here and they play a role, etc. So I think the example of the Jews just concentrates our mind on an extreme case because of the religious vulnerability and other types of vulnerability, just about the sort of challenges around the strangers that have been let into cities. So to summarize, as we've seen, the common good, the idea of the res publica, is a fragile construct, and it's best realized in periods when there's growth and opportunity for everybody, and when urban elites, however unjust the principles of representation, feel confident about their ability to take certain risks. And the presence of recent arrivals or of settled communities of difference, as I call them, can foment aggression in difficult times when it's mobilized by civic actors. And surely people in your country know exactly what that's like. And the word stranger does not quite capture that blend of belonging, yet cherishing another identity too, another heritage that so many urban groups possessed and still possess. And I'm going to end here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Rubin. This was a very, very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
So I'm opening up the floor for discussion. Does anyone have any questions?
Or indeed suggestions or comments, people can, yeah.
Well, I'll try to break the ice.
Yes, do that. People do get shy on the screen.
I do have a few. One minor thing that's a correction and not a question. Dubrovnik Ragusa wasn't under Hungarian rule when they passed the statute. They were under Venetian rule at the time.
I'm sorry. Then that's my mistake. I'm very sorry.
No problem. Just so both you and everyone would know, they went under Hungarian rule in 1358, and they did remain there for a longer time, but essentially they were officially under Byzantine rule for centuries, but fairly independent. But when Constantinople fell in 1204, then in 1205 Venice took over Ragusa as most of the cities on the coast, and then they were formally dominated by Venice. But it doesn't actually change your general point that most of those Adriatic cities borrowed bits and pieces from each other's statutes, even when they were under different sovereigns. So
thank you very much. No, that's a really, really good correction. I'm very sorry about that mistake.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting set of statutes. It's so interesting. I mean, about this process whereby when you're betwixt and between, before you're a full citizen. So you have this, for example, if you're walking in the city with arms that you're not allowed to hold, you're not allowed to carry, of a type you're not allowed to carry, there's a fine, so many hyperpers, but the fine is larger for the local citizen than it is for his friend who's not, because what is the logic behind it? Not so liable, maybe doesn't know the customs so well. It's quite interesting. It's half the price. There were lots of very interesting, I really enjoyed working on those statutes, and we're so lucky because there's a wonderful scholar who published them and wrote a fantastic commentary. Is it Lenza? What is the name?
Nella Lanza.
Nella Lanza, yeah. So, thank you very much.
A general observation, when you mentioned all those provisions where they had to build a house, own real estate, and so on, usually, it's specific when we're teaching medieval Serbia, because there's a number of those cities on the Adriatic coast that are formally under Serbian sovereignty but have their own statutes, etc., Budva, Kotor, and so on. And we always say that, well, the difference between those cities is because their power is in trade, while in the mainland country, the power is real estate. Feudal lords have their big real estates and so on. But that may be so for the country and the city as a whole. But for individuals, probably the power of real estate is more or less the same. Just it's a different type of real estate. In a city, you'll own a house or a smaller plot of land in the part of the land that belongs to the city, while in the countryside, you may be a lord with lots of lands, but essentially the Middle Ages are about real estate.
Yes,
Do you agree, or am
definitely.
I overdoing it?
I mean, I think, as I intimated at the beginning of the lecture, the more I worked, the more I saw that the patterns of preoccupation between people who have one foot in the countryside and that, I mean, that a lot of there are similar issues, they take different shapes. So for example, what's really striking in Tuscany is that in the 14th century, a lot of villages and very, very small towns that are practically villages start legislating their own statutes. And these are literally rural statutes. What does that mean? Well, they have issues they care about. I mean, for example, a large part of any urban set of statutes is about regulating hygiene and cleanliness and who can put the refuse where and water supplies and dangerous and smelly animals where they go, etc. And quite frankly, I mean, that issue of resources also prevails in the countryside. And in areas that are densely also urbanized, there is so much coming and going between these communities that a good idea can also be applied in rural settings as well. The only difference I would say is that in a country like England, still in the 13th century and well into the 14th, you really do have a lot of people who own absolutely nothing but what, paraphernalia stuff that they have in their home or clothing and all that. And that would be in the countryside, mostly. Actually, and in cities, in cities, a lot of people do live in rented accommodation. So they would not have, but the aspiration is, so in a way, it's often the case that a newcomer, in fact, has to meet criteria that are more exacting than somebody who's just a poor person born in the city. It reminds me when I took my becoming a British citizen exam on the history and culture of Britain, and I was telling my husband, all these questions. I was studying it before I went to bed at night, and he said, "I don't know that. I'm born and bred." So I mean, there's something of that, more exacting. But there were people in cities who did not have, but anyone who could aspired to obviously build their own. And it was really moving to read these statutes from the Marche, where they say, you go and you pick really good stones from the river, and you can have so much straw, and you can have so many reeds from the riverside. So the environment of the location, what you can use in order to build your house, that first house. Yeah, it's super interesting.
Thank you very much. We have two raised hands. I think it was Nikola and Vladimir.
Ja sam
Nikola,
samo
go ahead.
želio
I
da
don't see
profesorice,
Vladimir. So wait. There's Vladimir. Yeah, okay.
Profesorice Nina, ja sam samo želio da pozdravim uvaženu gošću profesoricu, da pohvalim predavanje i vi ste pomenuli Kotor i Budvu, profesorice Nina.
Dobro, recite, pa ću ja
Pa evo
prevesti,
samo
he'll say in Serbian and
digresija
I'll
mala.
translate.
Moja profesorica s osnovnih studija, Nevenka Bogojević, je pisala u poslovnom intervju znači niz naučnih radova. Sigurno je gošća, uvažena profesorica čula za Nevenku Bogojević, Luvčević. Eto, samo toliko.
Hvala, Vladimir. So Vladimir
Znači,
is
sve
our
na
friend.
predavanje, eto. Pozdravite gošću od mene, eto.
Hoću, hvala.
Pozdravite još jedan put i tako.
Dobro, Vladimir.
Svako dobro od mene.
Hvala. Vladimir is our friend from Montenegro. He just wanted to say that he enjoyed the lecture very much, and
Thank you.
One of his teachers when he was studying at the Faculty of Law there was Professor Nevenka Bogojević Gluščević. Perhaps you know her or know of her because she worked a lot on the statutes of that part of the Adriatic coast.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. What do you work on, Vladimir? Could you ask him?
Pita čime se vi
Samo za
bavite.
prijevod, pitala me nešto profesorica.
Pitala je čime se vi bavite.
Pa ja se bavim krivičnim pravom, kriminalistikom, istorijom prava. Nina mi je buduća mentorka, moja najbolja drugarica, eto.
Hvala vam. So Vladimir is mostly doing criminal law and criminalistics, but he's trying to branch into legal history now. So he's our frequent follower. Now, Nicola had a question as well.
Sure.
Yes, hello, do you hear me?
Of
Yes.
course, yes. Loud
No, we
and
can
clear.
see you.
I want to ask how were gypsies treated in the medieval ages?
Okay, so I have a little bit about it, but a great friend of mine wrote a very pioneering book about them. So I know more than most probably. I mean, our first traces in medieval sources are from the 15th century. In fact, from about 1460. It's not very early. There may be a hint a little bit earlier about people who were supposed to have come from India originally. They were believed to come from India. And although they're given this name, ultimately gypsies would come from Egypt, they were believed to come from India. They were believed to have certain professions, like they dealt with horses, they had certain crafts, they were very good at making swords. This is what, there was this, they do not appear at all in any legislative document. They are not, I would say, until much later, they're not on the horizon of when a legislator or a town official is sitting down to write a document. They don't imagine them as possibly being one of the groups that may emerge. We have descriptions of them from Paris very early on. We have some descriptions of them from the Low Countries, which is interesting because actually in Northern Europe, whereas nowadays most of their locations are in other parts. So it is still a historical conundrum for a medievalist. It's a mystery still where they come from, how they come from. Should they be? I read a document about whether they should be Christianized or not. Are they pagans or do they believe in a god? There are far more questions about them in the Middle Ages than there are answers. But clearly it was a group. That is to say, they moved as a group. They moved as a group. That whenever they were perceived or described, they were described as a group that was believed to be a kinship group. Those who write about them believe that it's a kinship group, that this is a group with internal coherence. I mean, I don't know, when is do you know when are the first mentions, say, in the Balkans of so-called gypsies?
I don't know, but there was like some group named Cinsari. I don't know how to
Cinsari, yeah,
translate,
like Zingara,
but
yeah.
I don't know if they are like gypsies in that sense. There are some theories that they came with Roman cavalry to give.
Interesting. Because there's another issue which complicates matters, which in England, in the UK, we have a term which is now we call them, and in law they are called traveler communities. But these are mostly people who actually come from Irish origin, who were poor Irish people who basically migrated to at some point in the 18th or the 19th century, migrated to mainland Britain and did all sorts of menial jobs and were on the boundary of respectability and legality in terms of trying to make a living, and had certain expertise, again, in horses, because, of course, breeding horses is a very developed industry in Ireland and has been for centuries. And then for some reason, and I'm not sure how, in the 18th century, they're already called gypsies. Nowadays, so nowadays, when we have, because of the freedom of movement that we had until Brexit, we obviously have people who are, let's say, European Roma coming to the UK, and the traveler community want to emphasize their own indigeneity. That is to say, they are not newcomers, they belong, they're part of the scenery. They are not these people who've come from Romania or Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic or wherever. And so now it's a really very, very complicated set of denominators, and you can imagine anyone who's trying to legislate and to protect them by law and to give them social provision encounters. It's an absolute minefield in terms of the language. And I have to say that earlier this week we had a very unfortunate sort of public announcement by a very important and long-standing Black Labor politician who was an amazing woman. She was the first ever Black woman in Parliament. She's a person you wouldn't suspect of racism at all, but she made some very unfortunate statement about how travelers and gypsies and Jews, yes, they suffer, but they never had to sit in the back of the bus, if you know what I mean, like in America, in the southern United States. And all of a sudden, all these categories come together and are thrown together, and it's such a mess. But I'm afraid that I can't give you greater clarity in terms of the origins. We just have such sparse information before the later part of the 15th century.
Okay, thank you. And
but if I can just say, what I'm thinking is that a group like the Roma or like the Gypsies of the later 15th century, they definitely arrive in Europe at a time that it's very, very inconvenient to be a group of difference that has no privileges and isn't protected, because as I tried to convey to you, although rather quickly towards the end of the lecture, the late 14th, 15th century is not a good time it's not a good time for anyone. It's particularly not good for anyone who's vulnerable, who is legally vulnerable, who's vulnerable because of their religion, because of their appearance, because of all sorts of other markers of difference. And they definitely arrived on the scene at that unfortunate moment. Thank you, Nicola.
thank you too. Can I have one more question?
Of course, if Nina allows.
Naturally, no problem.
Okay, so I see when I go through Belgrade that the immigrants are mostly men. And when you talk about the strangers, you said that they were mostly lonely men that travel and that stuff. And I want to ask, were there women strangers? And if they were, like, how are the legal, the legislative for them? Because I see, like, men had to have the house and to be married and all that stuff. But were they like for women that legislative?
This is a simply excellent question, and had I had more time, we should have. I mean, we'd have another lecture, and of course, Nina is an expert on women. The legislation does not speak about forinseca or extranea, if you see what I mean. But it assumes, of course, as you rightly say, that they will come and that they will bring their wives. Oh, they will take a wife. But they do imagine certain interesting situations around women and foreigners in the following way. They're very vexed by the worry that a woman of the city who's born, who comes from a citizen family, might marry a foreigner. And then that foreigner, before he's become a full citizen, will get control of her dowry, or whatever she owns, or whatever she has access to, let alone her own good self. So there's a lot of regulation about not taking dowries out of the city if they belong to a citizen and the husband is a foreigner or somebody who has, which is also possible, two citizenships, which is another complication. The immigrant is not imagined in our laws as being a foreign woman. But of course, women did come, and we know that for sure, because whenever we have tax documents or any form of document that is like a census that tries to cover all the neighborhoods and say who lives where, we find women We find women with toponyms from other places. We find women that are clearly foreigners, but also in court cases, very, very common, women who are presented as being prostitutes are very often women who are recent arrivals, because it's like, well, we know the phenomenon in our own cities. It's because a combination of vulnerability, of the precariousness of labor. You may come and find a job, then you lose your job, or you get harassed at a job. I mean, it's so similar to our current situation, only in the Middle Ages, you have to go and look for it because the legislation will not even tell you that they are there. What's also super interesting about the period after the Black Death is, and this is across Europe, is that because of the importance of the textile industry, and particularly in places like England and Flanders, where textile is the industry, and there's mass production, a lot of women are needed in the textile industry, and women go to cities disproportionately compared to men. So again, wherever we have tax lists, like the famous lists for Florence from 1429, the Catasto, 1427, and we know name by name by name by name, we see, and we also have a similar list for York, that there are more women in the city, particularly more poor women, than there are men or poor men. So then demographers also say that the reason why the population did not recover after the Black Death, and of course it's partly because every 10 years or so you had the Black Death again in a smaller version, but still the plague was endemic, but also because you had what they call the sex ratio meant that there will always be about 10% of the people who might want to marry who cannot marry because they literally aren't men or women around, depending where they are. So the countryside had more men, the cities had more women, which also includes all those invisible immigrant women that you asked about. But typically the legislation is such. So this is where it's very, very important, if you're going to study the phenomenon, to study it not only through the normative texts, the laws, which are super interesting, as you saw, but also alongside it to study the documents of practice, which are what goes to court, what's said in court, what problems do people confront and bring to court, which are, as it were, the real life dilemmas. But I would say that there are even layers of the urban population that never even reach the court, because even going to court is an expensive and exposing sort of activity. And there's far more regulation in the 15th century as to who comes in, who goes out, who should belong in the city, who should not belong in the city. And that made life very, very difficult to those who did not manage to find themselves a niche in the city, male or female. It's a great question.
Thank you.
So what do you do, Nicola?
I'm a first year law student.
Well, I'm very impressed that you've joined us today. You mean you're an undergraduate?
I
A
didn't hear
starting
you, sorry.
student, yeah.
Yes.
I'm very impressed. Very impressed. You have a great future in front of you, I can see.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just a thought regarding the women strangers, maybe generally, now I know it's not an easy thing to say, but there were probably less women traveling alone on
Very true.
on longer journeys at the very
Yeah.
least. So they
Yeah.
could come as if a whole family tried to migrate to a city, husband and wife and their children and so on. Or now I know more early modern examples for this, but it's probably similar in the Middle Ages, say a young woman from a village going to the nearest city to find work, to work as a maid, as a serving girl, to try to earn some dowry. If she has
Yeah.
good luck, then maybe if she has nice masters that she works for, they might find her a good match in the
Very
city.
true.
So she might end up marrying in the city. If not, at least after some years, she'll return home with a better dowry and have a better chance to marry, etc. But men were more likely to go on longer journeys, either on purpose or say as mercenaries, as merchants, and so on, and then decide to settle somewhere, while women doing that individually were probably much more rare.
That's very true. And also, I mean, it's the vulnerability on the road. I mean, we know that. I mean, even pilgrims, who are supposed to be protected by canon law, they traveled in groups, and women traveled in groups if they want to do pilgrimage, of course. But and what you say is absolutely true. And this issue of gender in migration is very interesting. So a book that I really benefited from was a book by an American scholar called Sharon Farmer, who's written a wonderful book about silk work in medieval Paris, which was heavily feminine. Not only, but it was full of immigrants, actually from the Eastern Mediterranean. Interestingly, a lot of people, some were from Cyprus for some reason, and but also at the same time, she looks at these communities of Lombard men, of men living on Rue des Lombards, and she finds them in the courts. She finds them in the courts, complaints about sexual violence. Because clearly these groupings of men whose families are abroad, their mom, their wife, their dad, or even just, people who have a moral authority who might keep them on the straight and narrow when they're at home, they're without that. And they're on their own, and they're a menace. And that is why Fribourg insisted so much that if you come with your wife, you come and make a family so that you are not a menace. It's super interesting. Her analysis is super interesting. Yeah. No, that's very true.
The whole recommendation.
Sorry?
I'll look for that. Thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah, no, I think you'd love it. It came out, I think, just before COVID, maybe 4 years ago, something like that. It's a fairly new book. It's a really interesting book.
Okay, thank you very much. And as for pilgrims traveling, they sometimes even dressed as men so they'd be safer on the road when they didn't have groups.
That is so interesting.
So cross-dressing was a different issue, and then again, but they felt safer if they looked like a young man.
Well, Nina, I can give you perhaps a slightly weirder example, which is there is a very important Jewish book of the 13th century, which tells you how to live a virtuous life as a Jew. And it says, if Jewish women have to go on the road, I recommend that they dress up to look like nuns.
I understand, yes. A very logical piece of advice.
Yeah, so there we are.
Not sure how virtuous, but very practical.
Yes, exactly. Well, I hope that those are in the room, all of you, and those of you who just listened and felt maybe shy to ask questions. You can easily find my name. If you just Google me, you'll find my email at Queen Mary. If ever you have any interest that I can help with, or you want to ask a question or any follow-up, really, I mean, very sincerely, feel free. And also to say, and I mentioned this to Nina in the past, when we spoke, that those of you who are doing research in legal history, we may be developing a quite interesting forum about law and history, which I hope some of its activities may become hybrid. And I'm very happy through Nina too and the Forvm Romanvm to disseminate information about it if it does come to pass.
Thank you very much, Professor Rubin. Thank you for the wonderful lecture, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch, and we're not giving up hope on getting you to Belgrade in person.
I'm with you. I'm totally with you on that. Thank you so much, Nina. You've been a fantastic host.
Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good weekend. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir.
Thank you.